Nau mai hoki mai ki Branching Out, our podcast about Indigenous forests and forestry in Aotearoa. Today we're back with Greg, talking about the state of forests, forestry and ngahere in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So Greg, how would you describe our current state of forestry?
If we're thinking in terms of the exotic forestry, in my mind, I would say probably for the last 10, 15, 20 years, I would say it's mature. I guess the disappointing thing to me is that it's not changed terribly much in the last almost 50 years, I guess. When I first started engaging in forestry, when I started walking around the hills of Coromandel in Northland and looking at planted pine forests, even before I started as a forestry trainee. Well, what they did 50 years ago, they grew seedlings, they found sites to plant them, planted them, pruned them, cut them down and processed them. That, in a large extent, is still what they do now. There's a lot of research has gone on since then, but essentially not much has changed, particularly in terms of species diversity. But I think that's probably coming in the near future.
Okay, what makes you say that?
I would think it will be climate driven and to some extent socially driven as well. We've had a number of significant storm events quite recently that have changed the perception of forestry and its place in the landscape, and probably more so the way that forests are managed more than anything else. The wholesale clearance of hill slopes and exposure to climate events that seem to be increasingly prevalent. Here we are in 2024, we've probably had, 2, 3 or 4 already for the Tōtara, Hawke's Bay region.
Yeah.
It's pretty significant events, let alone what happened in Auckland, Northland and other places. So I think there'll be a number of drivers of it. So in climate sense, probably it will be maybe a pathology, tree disease as climate warms. I remember years ago when climate change was being talked about and climate warming, and the response probably was, oh good, the trees will grow faster, so productivity will go up. But for everything that changes like that, there's always the downside somewhere. And we are increasingly seeing more and more diseases coming in on not just our forestry species, but also some of our horticultural and agricultural species as well. So if in 50 years' time I was able to look back, I would expect to see something quite different. Either species mixtures, the places in the landscape, or management structures, or probably all three of those things.
So I guess there's what you would expect to see, and then there's what you would want to see. You know, what is the future you aspire to for Indigenous forests and forestry in general?
Well, in general for forestry, looking at it as an Indigenous forestry scientist, but also as a timber user, I'd like to just see variety. And variety meaning that I can go down to my local timber merchant and plan on buying or being able to buy some pine or some Douglas fir, some eucalyptus if I wanted to, maybe some redwood. But certainly I'd be wanting to be able to buy some good priced rimu or tōtara or kauri timber that I know has come from a sustainable resource, been managed well, and that other trees have been planted to replace those trees that I've just taken to use. So there's a number of things that I think should be different about supplying timber, about growing trees. Forestry is not just about growing trees. It should never just be about growing trees. It should be about where those trees go in the end, who's going to use them and what they're going to be used for. But currently we seem to segment the industry or the chain of events that goes from selecting parents through to growing trees to harvesting them to processing them to selling them. And I suspect that in each part of that step, the person who's involved in that step loses interest once that's gone. Once they've finished or concluded their part of the step, there doesn't seem to be a logical carry-on of interest. So once the truck goes out past the gate of the landowner, heads to the port or hopefully to a local mill, but increasingly less so, I suspect once the truck has left the landing site that the industry perhaps has lost interest until planting time arrives and or the check arrives from wherever they've sold the logs to.
So sort of maybe a disconnected process, or once those logs have left the premises, there's not another thought to them.
Absolutely, and that was quite different under the days of the New Zealand Forest Service. So that was quite an integrated organisation, and it ran its own nurseries, ran its own silvicultural systems and had control of significant areas of Crown land and ran processing plants and what have you. And in reality, created communities where previously communities had withered away and died because there had been no industry to keep people there. And they were also doing quite a lot of environmental benefits, particularly on the west coast of the North Island, where sand erosion, sand movement from the coast was quite significant around the Aotearoa Peninsula and Waiuku, northern Waikato, particularly around the Manawatu, where there were world record movements of sand dunes that were burying communities, roads, rail links, pasture land, and a lot of forest went in to control and to create resources around there. So there was quite an integrated industry at that stage, but now it seems very, as you say, disconnected and possibly a little bit dysfunctional at times as well.
Thinking about what you would aspire to with Indigenous forests and forestry and everything that you've said, if we were being pragmatic, what are some of the immediate changes that we could make to build towards that future?
People have still got to be able to see that this is a real opportunity with Indigenous forests and Indigenous forestry. I would like to see a suite of large, well-managed plantings around the countryside on particularly good quality landscapes where good management and silvicultural practices could be developed and implemented, and have them in places where people could go and see them. I could write all the papers you'd like and put them into science journals. I could give presentations and have slides and whiz-bang talk and a lot of fancy words. But if people can actually go out into a forest, put their hands on a tree and go, oh, actually, this is only 20 years old and yet it's not that far from being harvested. Now that is something that might interest me. So we can do a number of things. We can do more science with those sorts of demonstration plantings. We can do management and we can learn about silviculture. We can learn about disease resistance, if that's part of it. We can learn about increasing productivity, and we can learn about the effects potentially of climate change and a whole range of other interesting things.
What are the most significant changes we need to make to build a better future for Indigenous forests?
It's really around investment, investing in the species and investing in those species' futures and our futures as well. Because at the moment, we're not investing in many of those species, which means we're not investing in their futures and we're not investing in our futures as well. So I think if we take a kind of a holistic approach to it, yes, it'll be for our benefit, but it'll also be for the species' benefit. If we want to think of ourselves, place ourselves at the top of the pyramid and say we're the guardians, whether that's an overly ambitious view of ourselves in the world is for others to decide. But if we are the guardians, reality is we've created the current situation of where many of these species are, how big the species populations are, and potentially the diseases that are occurring. And certainly we appear to be the generators of climate change at the moment. So if we accept all or some of that, then we have to get involved again. We can't just go, okay, we stopped logging and we stopped burning and we stopped whatever else we were doing that degraded the forests and degraded individual species. Some of those species, like kauri, for instance, have only got 1% of what used to be. 1%. That's how tenuous it is in the landscape. And the only place it exists naturally in the world is here. So we got involved and we created that situation. So in my opinion, we have to get involved again for its future and for its or their futures and our own. It's got to be a very bland landscape if everything is radiata pine, plastic stuff imported from overseas, you know.
You told me something once. When we're thinking about the investment needed into our Indigenous forests and forestry, you told me something. You asked me what the most successful bird species is. Do you want to talk a little bit about that kind of thought?
Yeah, I think the most successful bird species is the chicken, I think.
Yep.
For all sorts of reasons, taste being one of them, easy to raise, what have you. We just don't, we just don't see the value. So you can see a value in a chicken because you can grow it quickly and people want to eat it.
Well, it's certainly the most abundant bird species in the world because of the investment that we've made into it.
Yep. People only invest when they see a potential return on that investment, and that's a financial return. So it's something I've pushed probably for the last 20 odd years or so again, is if we can unlock the economic potential of Indigenous species, then we unlock the potential for people to invest, for their desire to invest, because they will see then a return on that investment. But a return on investment can be more than just dollars in your back pocket. There's all that journey along to receiving that financial investment. And it may be that you only receive financial return on investment from part of that research or planting that you do, because you might, in full thought, do some planting, manage it, do some selective harvesting from it, make some money, do some more selective harvesting from it, make some money, get down to a point where you have 100 or maybe less than 100 of that species per hectare left, and turn it into a long-term carbon or forestry or conservation or cultural stand. So it then switches from an economic investment to a social investment. But along the journey, you can make money, or should be able to make money out of it. It just requires some clever thinking, and there are some people who are thinking along those lines right now about how those systems might work, but they need to be tested, ground truthed, and then get put out into the wider social arena for people to view and to make decisions about. People can make decisions not to do stuff as easily as they make decisions to do stuff. My hope is that there's good information for them to make those decisions on. Because at the moment, we're kind of doing some of it on a very small scale research trials and research investment. But if we were going to do a lot more of this, it's going to require a lot more investment.
Yeah. And so I guess when you sort of state that we're making decisions based on small trials that we have, or maybe trials that aren't really suitable to provide this kind of decision-making information, reflecting on that, what are some of the biggest myths that we have around our natives and their suitability to be forestry species?
Well, the biggest myths have been around forever, and that they're slow growing. Have always been slow growing, always will be slow growing, and that you won't get a mature crop for hundreds of years. And that was what I was first, not so much taught, but that kind of seemed to be the common mythology. If you're, a Pākehā first arriving in Aotearoa in 1839, 1840, just as the treaty was about to be signed, like one of my great-grandfathers was, if somebody had said to him, I want you to make up something and get it into the social thinking and have it still there in almost 200 years' time, what do you think it might be? And if somebody had said, go and tell everybody that New Zealand native trees are slow growing, and you'll find in 200 years' time, and sadly, that's what people will say. That's what people will tell you. That they're difficult to grow in the nursery, they're expensive to buy because they are at garden centres, they're slow to grow, they need certain conditions, you won't get money back for hundreds of years. Those are all things that, if you want to call it prejudices, that sit out there in the New Zealand psyche. They're well and truly cemented, absolutely well and truly. So if you were going to change anything, that's what you've got to change first. And you've got to be able to show it. But as I say, we've done small trials and we've seen really impressive results, which suggests that within the DNA of most of the species we've looked at, there is an ability to grow fast. Because what we see now, if I was to take you to the far north, for instance, or to the Coromandel, and we were to look at a second growth kauri stand, and it would probably be on the top of a ridgeline, and that ridgeline would probably be quite dry, seasonally be very dry. And if we looked at the tree growth, it would really be quite slow. But that's only because we are looking at trees on atypical landscapes. The best trees are gone. They used to be down on good growing landscapes, down around the edges of the harbours, the Kaipara Harbour, and for instance, that's where a lot of harvesting was done from, because they could just fall straight into the water, straight next to the boat, and away you go. Happy days. And then it got more difficult as you had to go up into more deeply incised terrain. How did you get trees down and what have you? So as you went further up and people start to look at growth rates, they start to see, that looks quite slow. Well, you're not on a normal landscape where you might get good growth. If I took apples or avocado and put them into the wrong landscape, they'd either get frosted or they'd get blown out or whatever.
Well, you certainly wouldn't blame the apples or the avocado for where they were placed.
No, and that's what we've got to think about. We've got to go back to first principles and apply the same logic to our native species. Yes, in some instances, some of the places that we might want to return or restore native species to will be those upland, more difficult sites where growing seasons are a little bit slower, the climate's a little bit colder, those sorts of things. But those will be quite different to plantations, Indigenous plantations. So if we want to grow good trees, then follow the same logic as we do for other forestry species and for other economic exotic.
Yeah. I guess when I hear conversations about investing into Indigenous forestry or, afforestation, reforestation, what have you, I hear a lot of it being discussed around planting on marginal land or land that has kind of low use, or they call it underutilized. Some people have some feelings about that and the language used to describe that kind of land. But what's your view on that?
I think in the first instance, there's a need for some sort of tree cover in a lot of those sort of places, and they will change. Marginal land, is it because it's steep and eroding? Is it wet? Is there something about that land that makes it difficult to be productive on? So it's only marginal in terms of production generally. That's often where that phrase comes from. It's land and trees will grow there or plants will grow there. But I initially would think, and I usually say to landowners who are starting to think about converting from, say for instance, radiata pine to Indigenous forestry, then start on your good land. Gain experience, gain knowledge about what you can and cannot do or should not do. And if you used your good land, or some of your good land, then you're likely or more likely to get a good result. Which means then that investment that you put into that will get a return on it. But you will also keep the community coming along with you. So if you go to your more difficult sites where there's heavy gorse infestation or it's seasonally very wet and a lot of ponding and trees drown basically in situ, if you come back in 5 years' time and there's been a significant amount of money invested from your community into that and they don't see anything for it, and you say, oh, well, that wasn't a good idea, let's go to the next site and try that. Probably you'd be lucky if you got half your people who invested the first time round would open their wallets again and go, oh yeah, let's have another go. So if you take it from the other side and go, let's do the good sites. Let's do a couple of good sites. Let's get everybody going. Let's gain some experience. Talk to the people who know a little bit about what they're talking about. They can guide us. But within a few years, then the locals become the experts, become their own experts. So there's kind of a lot of wins out of that. But you've got to make sure that you bring people along with you. It's all very well planning stuff, but you've got to bring the people along. Otherwise, it's a bit of a one-person journey.
When you're talking about the myths of what people currently believe around Indigenous species for Indigenous forestry, and we're thinking about decision makers and investment, is there anything that you'd like to communicate to decision makers around investing into Indigenous forestry in New Zealand?
There's a real opportunity sitting there in front of us. We saw it once, but we didn't see it in its entirety. We saw parts of the opportunity and we went into exploitation mode, if you like. Now there's a chance to rebuild that opportunity. It requires something beyond just 1, 2 or 3 years timeframes. This took us nearly 200 years to get to where we are now after the signing of the treaty. It shouldn't take us another 200 years to get back to where we should or could be. But in 20 years' time, I would like to think that with investment, we could have made some good progress back to that, what was that movie, Back to the Future kind of thing. We know the quality of our trees. We go back to first principles again. They are trees that grow wood and they grow really good wood. If we take that and move that forward into initially maybe an industry perspective, but then as they grow into a wider community perspective, then I think we've achieved something. But it's, you cannot just go, here's $100,000 and expect to have changed all we did, all the harvesting, all the burning, all the wastage, and expect to recover that. It's a bit like a conversation I had with somebody about planting riparian strips along waterways on farmland. And I said, are you trying to tell me that 1 or 2 rows of trees is going to ameliorate all the activity that the farmer's doing on either side of that, the 100 acres or more, either side of that riparian strip, those 2 or 3 trees between you and the waterway is going to make that difference? And I said, you're dreaming. And I say, these are things you've got to approach with your eyes wide open and your brain wide open. You've got to see the realities. And the reality is, yes, we didn't get to a radiator industry as dominant as it is in 5 minutes. It won't take 5 minutes. It'll take more than like 10 or 20 or 30 years of good funded research and good funded activity to get from where we are now to more of a solid Indigenous plantation future, I think.
So what I'm hearing is that's possible within my career.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. If the funds were available, you could make a difference within less than 10 years just by doing those large demonstration trials around the country, across different landscapes, different combinations of species, and just get out there and do it.
Well, thank you so much, Greg, for sharing your understanding for where Aotearoa is at with its Indigenous forestry. And that wraps up this week's episode of Branching Out, where we dive into Indigenous forests and Indigenous forestry practices. Tune in next time for more. Mauri ora.